Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. In recent weeks, crude oil prices have soared past $80 a barrel as demand far outpaces supply. A couple of weeks ago, OPEC and its oil-producing allies, known as OPEC-plus, put a hold to their current output levels, saying they are not going to loosen the taps despite the skyrocketing prices and pressure from the United States for them to cool the market.
For more, we connect to Philip Vahn, Senior Managing Analyst for Asia Oil Market Insight and S&P Global Platts, to discuss the recent price surge in oil and how it impacts consumers. Thank you for coming in, Philip.
Good morning. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Now, firstly, what can the U.S. or anyone else outside of the OPEC do to bring oil prices down? And can you explain why OPEC is flatly dismissing the Biden administration's calls for them to fire up output?
Right. Outside of OPEC, I'd say probably the US and perhaps Brazil. Now, US is probably one of the very few non-OPEC producers with capacity and capability to boost production by 1 million barrels a day or more in a relatively prompt manner, let's say within a year. Rising prices have definitely revived US shale activity. And certainly the rising rig numbers are a good indication that US oil production could once again reach the peak output level of about 30 million barrels a day seen before the pandemic. Now, as for Brazil, I understand around 30 crude oil projects are expected to start operations from this year until 2025. Just to name a few from top of my head, Buzios, Lula, Oeste. These are some of the key projects in the country that are expected to handsomely contribute to the global supply increase over the next few years. And to address your second question there, why OPEC is so stubborn, right? Well, two reasons come to my mind quickly. Firstly, you have to remember, unlike the US, many of the OPEC producers, they depend heavily on their oil revenue. Obviously, the OPEC producers know the pain of ultra-low oil prices of 2020 and how that seriously hit their national budget and government finances. So the very cautious approach in production control they're adopting, it does make sense after that big painful lesson learned on massive oversupply of 2020. And lastly, the second reason is due mainly to what I call a wildcard, Iran. If nuclear talks progress well and eventually set the stage for lifting of the sanctions on Tehran, that's going to allow up to 1.3 million barrels a day of Iranian oil returning to the market. So in a way, OPEC plus strategy is to maintain the relatively tight market condition in a way to create that buffer against Iranian oil possibly flooding back to the market eventually one day.
Right, so there is a lot of finger pointing going on. It's fair to say OPEC doesn't want to give an inch due to the reasons you just mentioned there. But what, if any, financial, political, diplomatic tools does the Biden administration have in its arsenal should it decide, look, enough is enough, we can't handle this anymore, and it's time to force OPEC's hand?
Right. Well, I guess one quick solution is to, again, it's that wild card, Iran. So play that Iranian card, because the return of that massive volume of Iranian oil, it all depends on the US at the end of the day, right? So if Washington could make extra efforts to wrap up this nuclear talks once and for all, and eventually let the Iranian oil flood the market once again. And apart from that, I guess the US could surely take full advantage of its diplomatic power and big oil majors' business know-how to form some sort of a separate group or an organization of petroleum-producing nations within the North, Central, and South Americas. Now, this idea actually came from one of the Chevron executives that I met a few years ago. Now, when you consider the US, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and the Americas, this group put together has quite a sizable production capacity combined. And if they could continue, if they could convince Venezuela even to leave the OPEC and join them, that would be a big bonus, obviously. Now, the idea is to really form some sort of a competitor organization to OPEC. Now, producers in the Americas, they have stellar marketing power in Asia now, and they could seriously increase competition with the Middle Eastern producers. So, yeah, the idea of producers in the Americas forming a separate competing organization to OPEC. Now, if Washington can somewhat just simply suggest or throw such idea in any major global summits or meetings, that will definitely keep big OPEC producers on their toes for sure.
Well, before we let you go, finally, South Korea has another problem, namely a shortage of urea water solution, a chemical needed to power diesel vehicles. And China is the country's biggest supplier, but China's facing its own energy crisis, so it has curbed exports. Does Seoul have time to find urea from other countries? And do you think it was an oversight to rely so heavily on China in the first place?
Right. So I understand South Korea practically stopped producing urea water solution or diesel exhaust fluid. Let's just call it DEF around a decade ago. I wouldn't blame anyone for this because DEF is such a low value product with very little margins and profitability. Now, for South Korea's very highly sophisticated refineries and chemical plants, it will be an absolute waste to be making such low-end product, and they're better off just keep on focusing on manufacturing and producing high-end liquid fuels and chemicals. So at the end of the day, it's all down to the economics, right? I mean, if it's cheaper to import rather than producing it, then be it. That's how the market functions. Now, your question on has South Korea been relying too much on China for DEF? Yes, perhaps, but one thing is clear. DEF is not some sort of a precious or very rare commodity or anything. It can easily be sourced from all across the world. As I mentioned earlier, DEF is a very low-end, low-value product. Practically any country can produce it. There are many, in fact, DEF manufacturers across Southeast Asia, South Asia, Oceania, the US. So yes, it was cost-effective and efficient to import from China in a massive bulk, but troublesome it may be, South Korea will have no little problem resorting to diversification of DEF supply sources, and well, they just have to increase the frequency in the shipments too, I guess. So yeah, no real panic.
Yeah, well, Philip, I'm sure what you just said there is music to the ears of many a truck driver here in South Korea, because a lot of them are particularly worried at the minute. But we appreciate your insights, and hopefully we'll get to speak to you again soon. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks.